Hello again, everybody. I'm Chad Lack, your host for the Cage Rage podcast. I'm here with my confidant and guest host, Miguel Iterati. Miguel, how are you doing today?
Terrific, Chad. Thanks for having me. Glad to be back. And thanks to everybody out there in podcast land.
Yeah, we're going to be talking boxing today. Don't forget to go to thesweetscience.com and theboxingchannel.com to check out more on boxing and all your boxing needs. They fulfill everything that you can possibly want in boxing. That's theboxingchannel.com and thesweetscience.com. So we're talking boxing today. Miguel, fill us in. Where are we at from last week when we talked about boxing? I think we talked a lot about Canelo, where he was heading to next. We've got some heavyweight stuff on the line. We have a few things that happened last week. We had some new technology that we kind of looked at with Facebook, some smaller fights. Talk to me a little bit about what happened last week in boxing. What's going on?
Well, there's a ton of stuff, obviously, and we can't cover it all, but we'll stick with the big points. Obviously, the follow-up and the heavyweight stuff that you're referring to is Anthony Joshua defended his belt against Alexander Povetkin. He scored a 7th-round knockout. It has to rate as an impressive win. Povetkin's only previous loss before that was to Vladimir Klitschko. Klitschko dropped Povetkin 4 times in that fight, and Povetkin got up and lasted the 12 rounds. So when you talk about a 7th-round stoppage, you got to talk about Joshua doing something that had never been done before. So he kind of elevates himself again with that performance where he'd had a couple of stale performances. He needed that to elevate and work on his next big fight. What's going on for his next big fight? You got WBC world champion Deontay Wilder and Tyson Fury. Tyson Fury, 27-0. He's the lineal champion. He's the guy that beat Klitschko and then kind of saw the wheels fall off his career with, cocaine and a bunch of kind of partying habits. And we could talk about that another day. Tyson Fury gave up those belts without losing them. And now he's back. He's had 2 fights on a comeback. He got to about 400 pounds while he, spent 2 years away from boxing, basically, or over 2 years. And now he's, boxing again at about 240. And, he brings a completely different wrinkle to the table, almost a Muhammad Ali type of, B-class Muhammad Ali, but like a Muhammad Ali type of trash talk. His trash talk is a B-class, but his in-the-ring style is like a B-class Muhammad Ali in some ways in that, I don't know, Ali had knockouts and had power that Tyson Fury doesn't have, which forces him to rely on style. And for a big guy, he has some movement and some style. So he definitely brings an interesting wrinkle to the heavyweight division. So Wilder and Fury meet on December 1st at the Staples Center, and the winner hopefully gets Joshua at the beginning of next year. Now that's the big news in boxing as far as everyone's concerned. I'm also looking at the World Boxing Super Series, which is kicking off their bantamweight tournament this weekend. It's very interesting because as you alluded to in other conversations, MMA seems to be moving away from tournaments, and boxing with the World Boxing Super Series seems to be heading back into them. And what you have is 16-0 Naoya Inoue in Japan defending his WBA World Bantamweight title against Juan Carlos Payano. Payano, a very good opponent, 20-1 overall. He comes out of the Dominican Republic, and Florida is his base. The only loss on his career is to Rashid Warren. Warren, a world champion in his own right. Payano and him went back and forth, and Payano has a win on him and finally lost to him. So just a top-level fighter. Warren, an Olympic gold medalist for the United States. But now he gets a whole different ballgame, and that's the monster Inoue this weekend. So, hey, that's tournaments in boxing.
So let me get this straight. Boxing is moving away from the traditional boxing establishment, use the rankings, etc., go through rankings to make sure that you get the exact right champion, and then from there lead into a prize fight. And they're going back to the idea that, hey, maybe we should do some of this crazy MMA stuff and go into tournaments. While MMA, other than obviously the Bellator thing, they're moving into tournaments again, which I enjoy. But so boxing is moving back into tournaments. Is that just in Japan, or is that an international thing?
No, it's definitely here's the deal. The bottom line is the tournaments are always going to have their appeal, and I believe boxers and MMA fighters, at the very essence, are very similar. The specialties they have are very different. You have to respect that, but they're very similar in their wants and needs. You know, they want to make money. They'd like to fight on a nice stage. You know, nobody wants to fight in a dirt floor, you know, anymore. And so you got to provide a show. And MMA and boxers, you know, they're very similar at the essence. Now, where things become different is on the business end. And in the UFC, which basically dominates the MMA world, you have a company that has a 700-man roster, so they can basically make whatever fights they want. There really is no like, oh God, we're going to have to deal with this guy who's also bringing along his promoter and blah, blah, blah. But that's what you have in boxing. Dana White is rumored to have made a $500 million offer to world champion Anthony Joshua, the heavyweight boxer, just to get him under his, or to get him talking to him, or if the offer wasn't happening, he hinted that the offer was going to be there when Joshua was a free agent. Joshua signed under Eddie Hearn. But the bottom line is that Dana White realized then he's got Anthony Joshua. Now, how do you matchmake for this guy? Because all the other heavyweights are owned by other people, you know, and he would have inserted himself in there. So the bottom line is the businesses are completely different. You can't just matchmake and things like that because you got to go in there and you got to work on, you know, the negotiating part of making the deal. So what happens here is the UFC can control things. Boxing is just a mess. The sanctioning bodies all have different rankings and things. And the World Boxing Super Series is a well-funded group backed by Sauerland out of Germany that is doing international tournaments. They finished the Cruiserweight tournament that crowned a unified champion, united all four of the world championships at Cruiserweight. They finished the light heavyweight tournament that was rocking in terms of great action and stuff. So they've put together, you know, already two tournaments that they've completed, including one where George Groves fought Callum Smith in the finals in Saudi Arabia, which, you know, talk about international locations where they're banking money. You know, those guys are paying a site fee to lure those shows there. Same thing happened with the WWE, where they got a major show done in Saudi Arabia this year because they're shelling out money to bring shows in. You know what I mean? So the World Boxing Super Series definitely has an international feel, and this is their third tournament that starts this weekend.
So you're saying that Dana White actually offered one of the top heavyweight boxers a rumored $500 million just to sign with him to fight MMA?
I believe Dana White's on record as saying he was interested in boxing, and Joshua and him are said to have had some type of conversation about where Dana said to him, if you're available, come see me, don't sign, I got something for you. And he had rumored to be put together something like a $500 million offer. Now, did that progress? How far does it go? Only Dana knows, or Dana may have confirmed and stuff like that. But the bottom line is that the interest in boxing was there. After the Mayweather thing, they talked about Zuffa boxing. And after the Mayweather thing and the way they saw money, Dana was looking for a way to get into the boxing world. But he found it difficult because it just doesn't work the way his UFC works, where he really doesn't have to compete with anybody. Somebody doesn't want to do a fight, they run the risk of getting cut from the contract, you know? So for Joshua to fight Wilder, you need the premier boxing champions and Al Heyman to get together with Eddie Hearn and come to a deal. Plus, in addition to that, you may need HBO and Showtime and Sky Television in England all to decide to work with each other and not demand worldwide rights or whatever, you know. Who knows how complicated those international deals get in boxing, but that is the difference. So Dana White put his toe in the water in boxing and pulled it out because he said, no, if I have to do this, I really got to do this. And, you know, right now is not the right time. You can't do it and run the UFC.
Right. So this brings us to kind of our next topic, and we're going to get to something called the 50, 100, 150, and 200. We'll get to that in a minute. But I want to this alludes to something else that I want to get to before we do that, which is this. When we're talking about international, global competition among combat sports and bringing in all types of alternatives, well, one thing that we can't avoid now is the technology to do this, because You know, there are ways now with streaming to watch pay-per-views without necessarily buying pay-per-views. There are ways to do things in England. I may be talking not quite correctly here, but my understanding is that the British don't allow pay-per-views. I think that's correct. Something to that effect.
No, they have
So
pay-per-views. They have pay-per-views. They have boxing pay-per-views. Joshua's on pay-per-view. Sky TV, their cable company, has a pay-per-view arm, and they deliver boxing at the very least on pay-per-view. But the pay-per-view prices aren't exactly as high as in the United States, and they don't rely on it as heavily as the States does as an income stream. They rely more on live gate.
okay, so whatever the case may be, there I'm obviously off on my facts, but what I am saying is this: there's a technology gap that is trying to be maneuvered through right now through combat sports. And I think we're seeing it more in combat sports than anything else out of necessity, simply because combat sports is kind of the only thing that does pay-per-view and really depends on pay-per-view for their big paydays. Whereas, you know, football, soccer, which I guess if you're in Europe, football is soccer. But American football or football in Europe, soccer, you know, basketball, baseball, whatever, these sports, they don't depend on pay-per-view at all. Whereas combat sports, specifically MMA, the WWE, if you want to call that a combat sport, and it's an entertainment, but nonetheless it's combative, and certainly boxing and MMA, these things rely heavily on pay-per-view for their funding. So they have to start looking at different ways to achieve the financial gains that they need to stay growing and being competitive. Where do you see all of this going right now? Because there's a big change. We saw a lot of differences in Bellator this weekend, and I think it's the tip of the iceberg. We saw boxing started with the Facebook thing this weekend was a little bit different. I don't know how much you saw of that, but it was kind of complicated to watch because there was a lot of feeds with Facebook viewers actually commenting on it, and I didn't like it very well. But I think it's a good start, and I think it certainly shows where we're leading towards. And I think this is a good way to segue into what we're looking at with that, because we're talking about, look, if we're talking about you know, international and global entertainment, where do we go from here? What happens next?
Yeah, I mean, as you alluded to, and we'll stick to boxing for the conversation, right? But the history of the combat sport, the history of boxing is that boxing was always at the cutting edge of technology. And in every way, shape, or form, you had shrewd characters, such as you have Eddie Hearn today, Tex Rickard, you know, in the 20s and prior to that, and, you know, guys everywhere in between. Everybody was looking for a way to make money, obviously, and exploit it, and they knew that boxing was a key, that if you got it right, that you would make big money. So they were always hanging around looking for the technology thing. Back in the old 1890s, when they were starting to put together what became the film industries and film, you had guys working on their brand of camera. Kodak was one of them, and there were other competitors and things that made cameras, and were practicing, you know, the booths with the camera, keeping the camera in the film, and how much film can we take 3 minutes at a time, can we take 5 minutes, and all that was technology advancement. All of a sudden they could tape it. But all those guys had ties to boxing that said, hey, look, you know, boxing is actually an ideal way to test the cameras because there's a lot of motion and things like that. So they became ideal. In the very first, you know, sets of films that were ever filmed, many hours of it exist of boxing and people simulating boxing and things like that, actual legit boxing, because of their ties to the film industry. You know, you go into the Jack Dempsey days, and what made Dempsey and international stars. He became right around the time where the radio was starting to be in every home. So people could actually be at home. And there's still, for a lot of Dempsey's fights, there would be a transmission and people would gather at a local place transmitting it because not everybody had a radio in their home. But picture a time where people were like, holy crap, the radio, like the most mind-blowing thing that you could ever have, a box that gives you, that you can hear in your house, where before that, you can watch the fireplace. What do you got? So read, that type of thing. So real, legitimate, here's the key to it. Here's the thing that I'd like our listeners to realize is behind every million people buying a radio, there's the one dude who created it cashing in on it. And he had to get something to transmit on that, right? What better to transmit? What better way to catch the imagination of the nation than they could listen to the fight live? So, the radio was another step in boxing. Pay-per-view started maybe with New Kids on the Block or some crap like that, right? But it became, as you said, the home of MMA and boxing. And, both groups pretend and lean on pay-per-view to present their most elite events still. And that's what you're stating is at risk, which I agree with you, is that formula of cashing in with the pay-per-view the best way to present your top talent, and is it the best way to monetize that, or is it going to be some type of big-time deal that assures that you've got a transmission around the world in a nice format that everyone can see, and you've overcome time and language barriers and all kinds of crap. I don't see that yet. I think we're in an experimental stage right now.
Yeah, I agree with you. By the way, the first pay-per-view, somebody's going to correct me for being wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure I'm right about this. I'm almost positive that the first pay-per-view was actually WrestleMania 1. Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant. If it wasn't Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant, then it was Hulk Hogan and Macho Man Savage. Is that correct?
No, actually, I think Miguel was the first pay-per-views with the old NWA with you know what I'm talking about? Tony Schiavone and
yeah.
I think
look, the first, I don't know if they were the actual first paper. I could look it up.
The first pay-per-views, I'm pretty sure the first pay-per-views were actually some kind of combat sports, I guess is what I'm getting at. I don't know the ins and outs of it, but what I'm saying is like just like you had alluded to earlier, from Jump Street, from the very beginning, like I think you'd said in a podcast, maybe our first boxing podcast, that the first ever full-length film cinematically was of a boxing match, correct?
Yeah, well, you got to look at technology and what they did. So when film came out at the very beginning, you could go and see it in the theater maybe, and they also had booths. They'd bring a booth, and you'd sit in a booth, put a nickel in or whatever, and you'd see film. And you'd see like a guy walking a dog or someone juggling or, no sound, right? But it's just the unbelievable seeing a film for the first time. That's what actually was being transmitted there, right? So what happens is, in the film, the technology starts to become, can I film 5 minutes without stopping? Without reloading camera and stuff like that. Then can I extend that to 10 minutes, to 15 minutes? So at some point now, you can film hours or whatever. But at some point they got to film about 2 hours worth. And one of the first full-length feature 2-hour films that went out to the world was Bob Fitzsimmons' fight with Jim Corbett. So it was boxing. People went to the theater to see boxing. And how did both guys make $1 million off of the first film, and how did that become? The bottom line is people were going to see that because they wanted to actually see it. They wanted to see a film, whatever it might be, and the fact that it was a boxing match might even be secondary. But because film was such a novelty that actually people had to go see the theater, kind of like going to see the circus and stuff. You had to go see the new film in the theater. So just a whole different exploitation of how boxing and the businesses get together,
Yeah. Okay, so we'll talk more about that a little bit later in the MMA portion of the podcast of CRP. But I want to get to something else right now, which is a segment we're going to start doing in the boxing podcast at least, and maybe we'll go into it with MMA too, but especially for the boxing podcast, because you're the archivist for the International Brotherhood of Prize Fighting, the sweetscience.com and the boxingchannel.com. I'd like to be able to utilize that just a little bit and pull some of your expertise out of the woodwork and allow you to talk just a little bit about the historicity of boxing in a unique way. There's a magazine that I've been fascinated with for many years, and magazines are kind of on the outs now, speaking of technology. And one magazine that still kind of hangs around because it's just so damn good is Scientific American. And they're a magazine that's been around for literally hundreds of years. And they do a segment every month at the back of the magazine that's called 50, 100, 150, and 200. And basically it says what it is about, what they had written 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, and 200 years ago. So what we're going to do is we're going to try and every now and then work into one of our boxing podcasts what happened at 50 years ago or 100 years ago or 200 years ago in boxing on this date or around this date. So, Miguel, on October of sometime a long time ago, to start out with, we'll be a little lenient on you right now because I'm kind of hitting you. I'm kind of hitting you with this on a surprise attack. But I know you know a lot about it, and without being too prepared, so I'll go easy on you. Give me something that happened, let's say 150, 200 years ago in October. Go.
All right. First,
you're on the spot, man. I'm testing you. Show us what you got. This is your medal.
First, let's preface this by saying, boxing, as we recognize it now, sometime in the late 1800s, it became a sport where, it was covered as a sport by newspapers and things like that, and there were champions and things, and fighting with gloves and that type of thing. Before that, you're talking about less rules, bare knuckle, and boxing or pugilism, whatever you want to refer it to, probably more closely resembled MMA, including a lot of the more tension that comes with contests, just more rudeness to the contest, right? So now when you're asking for stuff about 200 years ago, there are not a lot of sources for it. There may be sources in the newspapers and things, and a lot of the times that's looked at as a civil disruption and things. But you got to go to good old England. So you're putting me up there with the Scientific American, which, they have 200 years of history for a reason, as you pointed out. So you're putting me on the spot that you got to do something good. So let's trump them a little bit. And let's go back 300 years. Not quite 300 years, but I can find a reference in October of 1726 to something that's also even, nowadays underappreciated, and that's women fighting.
Wait a minute, let me get this right. 1726.
26.
And you're talking October?
Yeah.
Because we're on October 4th, I think, today?
Yeah, in October of 1726.
Oh, okay.
See, the bottom line is like I said, you got women participating in the martial arts and things now as a sport, and they're behind, unfortunately, because that's the way things tend to play out, and
Sure.
that the men get more attention and things like that.
Yeah.
The women have been involved in the martial arts for a long time.
Yes.
One of the earlier podcasts we did, and we don't have too many, so people can look back. We mentioned Elizabeth Stokes, Elizabeth Wilkinson Stokes. She's a women's champion from the 1700s in England, and it just so happens October 20th. This is a reference. Actually, it's on among other places Wikipedia too. So she's starting to get her body of knowledge out there a little bit. But I found it interesting. So let me just read to you the Wikipedia entry because it says a lot of what you want to touch upon here.
Okay, that's Elizabeth Wilkins Stokes.
Wilkinson Stokes.
Okay.
Yeah. And so in October of 1726, a fight was announced between Wilkinson and Irish Mary Welch to take place at James Stokes' amphitheater. And the amphitheater is obviously like a gym nowadays, where an academy, so to speak. So a note at the bottom of the advert states, they fight in cloth jackets, short petticoats coming just below the knee, Holland drawers, white stockings, and pumps. At the time, it was more common for women, sometimes prostitutes, to fight topless.
Topless.
By competing topless. So, and
can you reread that for us, please?
There are drawings from those types of times and things, and illustrations of women, and some of them are topless and stuff. It's not, it's just an interesting sign of the times where it was seen as kind of like a base thing for women to be doing. So, by competing fully clothed, Wilkinson and her opponents defined themselves as serious athletes. So, even in the 1700s, you've got women kind of like saying, no, this is sport. We can compete in this just like the men can. And so I found it to be a very interesting entry from almost 300 years.
So in other words, by going fully clothed, they took the sexism out of it to some degree.
Yeah, I think, I think they make the reference to prostitutes in the Wikipedia piece, right? And I think what you're trying to do there is they're trying to define it, like they said, as sport. That's not something that's just done by a lower class of women.
Okay.
Something that can be done in a competitive fashion or even an educative fashion, because Wilkinson was, she was also a professor, a teacher at that amphitheater, with her husband. So they taught stick fighting and stuff like that, as we mentioned, and that sort of stuff. But it was a business, So her and her advertisements and things, but that's what went on there. Like I said, so she was trying to find herself as an athlete in the 1720s, 1726. So my hat's off to Elizabeth Wilkinson Stokes.
Most certainly. And can you go through the? I know that there was the idea that they had to fight with a coin in their hand. Can you tell the viewers a little bit about that again? Maybe go a little more in depth about how that worked. I think we kind of alluded to that, but we didn't get very in depth about that. And I had 3 different emails that asked varying degrees of questions about that.
All right, you're going to test my recollections and things, but again, you're talking about. I mentioned that beyond, prior to the 1870s, 1860s, you start to look a lot more like MMA, including what was known as the boxing rules at that time, which were like Broughton's rules, and then before that, no rules really. It is a rougher sport, than and I don't mean rougher, but ruder and less rules, made for a different style of sport. Just look at UFC 1 versus what the UFC looks like now.
Yeah.
And if you can't tell the difference, get your eyes checked. You know what I mean? So there is definitely an evolution of the sport. Now we're talking about the back end and history and stuff. I find that to be very interesting, because there always was that feeling of, hey, let's find out who's tougher, or one-on-one, or that feeling, and it comes through. And then with Elizabeth Stokes, she's the legendary woman that they found from back then. The bottom line is she was married to the owner of the theater, so the guy was involved, so it was a couple. They sometimes would be challenged as a pair, he'd fight the woman, he'd fight the man, she'd fight the woman, kind of thing. So all kinds of interesting stuff. One of the fights that she had was against a woman called Hannah Highfield, and the rules around that fight were said to be that no rounds. When they would call a round back beyond a certain point, you could have a 15-minute round. The rounds ended when somebody got knocked down. So once the knockdown occurred, the round ended. So sometimes you see 40-round fights, that lasted 5 hours and things like that. But those are things, extreme examples, but there were knockdowns, and some of the rounds were varying amounts. You can't say 3-minute rounds like you do in our head now, right?
Right.
So some of those fights could be 20 minutes with no rounds, or there could be 15 rounds in 3 minutes, depending on what was going on in the fights. But so in this case, they decided to fight, not to worry about, you get knocked down, you get back up, but the fight ends if the opponent they clutch a coin in their hand. And basically, they might have wraps, but you're talking about a bare knuckle fight, basically. And the first person to fall in such a way that they let go of the coin and the coin fell to the ground was the loser.
Well, that's fantastic stuff, Miguel. I hope that wraps up any questions that the viewers had. If you have more, hey, you know how to get a hold of us. Cadillac at thecageragepodcast.com. Miguel at thecageragepodcast.com. Of course, you can catch us on Facebook at the Cage Rage Podcast on Facebook, or just look me up, Chad Wagner on Facebook. Whatever you want to do, you can find us there. thesweetscience.com, theboxingchannel.com, the International Brotherhood of Prize Fighters, and Miguel is the archivist for them, among other things. We are working towards making everything better. I feel like we're getting better at this every day, but that doesn't mean we have it perfect. We're going to wrap this boxing up today because we've got 2 more to shoot. We're going to talk about MMA next because, of course, we have the McGregor-Khabib fight this weekend, and we've got some big stuff with John Jones eating cheese. Anything before we go, let's cover real quickly. Give me 3 minutes what's going on with boxing coming up, and then we'll close out the boxing podcast for the day, Miguel.
Well, as I said, you got the World Boxing Super Series this weekend. You got Inoue versus Payano in Tokyo. So you got to get up early to see the fight. Maybe tap some of those streaming sources or whatever, because it's not going to be on TV in the States. The World Boxing Super Series, definitely international, not state heavy. They had basically one American participating in the tournament. He went out in the first round of the first 2 tournaments. So I think Mike Perez, also in the heavyweight, would qualify as an American, but he's from Florida and Cuba. So they didn't have a ton of American participation, but the international field and talent that they're putting together is well worth watching. At bantamweight, you got a real chance at some explosive, real terrific, high-level fighting, and Inoue may be the best of the bunch. He's the favorite going into the tournament. So that's what we got to watch this weekend. You also got Eddie Hearn in Chicago. Hearn streaming, I believe, this show on DAZN. It's something new. We talked about technology. He will be delivering it, not on Sky TV. He's in Chicago with a show, a British promoter there. So that's something to keep an eye on. He's got heavyweights. He's got Beterbiev, the light heavyweight world champion, and a second super bantamweight world championship there as well. So pretty high level stuff this weekend as we look and wrap up the boxing world.
Great. Hey, Miguel, thanks. It's great working with you. Glad to see you again. We'll talk again very soon. You can let us know what you think of the show. Comments below. You can find us on YouTube. The Cage Rage Podcast on YouTube. The Cage Rage Podcast on Facebook. thecageragepodcast.com. Comment. Subscribe. Let us know what you think. It's all free for now. Take advantage of it while you can. We're working on getting videos put together of an ancient archive that goes back to at least 1997, if not more. We've got a lot of great stuff that we're working on right now. We're hopefully going to be able to start showing off a lot of the relics in the archives that we have hopefully more and more access to as we go. And we have a lot of big people that are looking at us and that they want to come on and get more involved. So we're trying to get things going, and we're looking better and better. Tell us what we can do to make you like us more and want to view more of what we've got going on. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you again. Namaste.